Okay, good afternoon, beautiful people. This is your host, Matthew, for the Day and Night podcast. I just want to thank everybody for joining us yet again. I know we was on yesterday, so it's probably a quick turnaround for you, but we have another good episode for you, and hopefully, like I said, everybody enjoyed yesterday's show. It will be reposted again Wednesday. Again, you can check us out. Check us out on Spotify. They'll be posted on Wednesday, and the link is on our YouTube channel. So, good people, please like and subscribe and share if you can. And so, with no further ado, the guest you will be coming on within the next 4 or 5 minutes. So, I'm just going, give the introduction as far as who she is and what we're going to talk about. So, she's a neuroscientist, and her name is Dr. Yaya. I'm not even going to butcher her last name. So I'm going to wait for her to come on, and I'll let her say what her last name is. But her name is Dr. Yaya, and she is a neuroscientist and artist born and raised in India. She earned an engineering degree and a master's degree in neuroscience and a doctorate in cognitive neuroscience. She then worked as a postdoctoral. Okay, so lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, guess who is showing up to the party for the first time in a month? So I would like for everybody to put your hands together, make some noise for the one and only, my other brother, well, my brother from another mother, my identical twin, Marcus Thomas Tompkins. And here
Hey, what's up, everybody? How y'all doing? I'm back.
he's
I
back in the
know
building. He's back in the building.
I'm back in the building. I
All
had
right.
to take care of some things. Life happens sometimes, so but it's all good now. So I'm ready to get back at it.
Okay, so that's like perfect timing. Now
Yeah.
we have our second guest. I'm sorry, our guest, Dr. Yaya. And I don't know if you can hear me or see me. If you can, could you please just let us know that you are here?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Okay, there you go. Yes, I can see you. How you
Okay.
doing?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's Sunday. It's a beautiful
Yeah,
weekend. It's kind of cold, but yeah, I'm doing
yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Is it
Okay, so
snowing where you are based?
no, I'm in Georgia, about 30
Okay,
miles south of Atlanta. It's just
okay,
cold. It's like 15 degrees, but no snow, thank God.
okay, okay. Yeah. It
All right.
snowed all through it snowed like all through Friday. So everything here is like covered in like a blanket of white, which is very beautiful.
Oh,
Nice. And
well.
where you
Yeah.
located?
I live in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside of
Okay.
DC. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Oh,
used to
well.
live in Maryland. I moved from, was it Woodbridge 5 years
Oh,
ago.
cool.
Yeah.
Oh, small world.
Mm-hmm. I
Yeah.
enjoyed it. Okay. So, Doctor, I don't want to butcher your last name. So I was gonna wait
It's
for you to come on. Okay.
yeah, yeah. It's no worries. It's not an easy name to pronounce, but it's easier than it looks.
Okay.
It's Vishwanathan, like making a wish.
Okay. Washanata.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I was just doing an introduction before you
Mhm.
chimed in. So if you would just go ahead and continue or take the floor, let us know who you are,
Okay.
um, and what it is you're going to talk about today.
Oh, sure. First of all, again, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Jaya Vishwanathan. I am a neuroscientist. So I've been working in neuroscience research since my undergrad, basically. And then I did a master's and a PhD, as well as a postdoctoral fellowship where I was doing experiments trying to understand the mechanisms by which Our brains take the external stimuli that come into our brains, like light waves, colors, sound waves, frequencies. So basically, auditory and visual stimuli that come in as physical stimuli. And then how does our brain go from that to like, oh, that's the doorbell ringing. I need to go open the door, or that's my mom on the phone and I need to say this to her or whatever. So how does our brain go from physical stimuli in our environment to behavior? So that's kind of broadly what I was studying. I currently work at the National Institute on Aging as a contractor within the Division of Neuroscience, where I support programmatic activities aimed at achieving the research goals of the national plan to address Alzheimer's and dementia.
Okay. Awesome.
So that's my research and scientific background. I'm also an author, so I've been very passionate throughout my career, throughout even when I was in high school. I've been very passionate about giving back to the community that I live in whatever way I can. And in my case, it took the form of education. So like giving back in terms of like tutoring, in terms of hosting hands-on activities where kids can learn to do little science experiments and things like that. And so one of the goals in life for me was to also like make neuroscience more accessible to the public and more less like technical and jargony and more kind of like understand the concepts that underlie how our brains work and then like make that fun for kids. And so
Okay.
I wrote and illustrated this book called Baby Senses,
Nice.
which is, thank you. Thank you. It's really something I'm super passionate about. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I talk in it, I talk about so baby animals talk to their adults about what gives them superpowers, what makes them special. And I tried to pick like scary animals, weird animals, icky animals, as well as pretty animals. Like it's not just like all of them are like monkeys or cool animals, but like, like kind of spanning a
Yeah.
spectrum. And then the adults answer in terms of their brains and their sensory abilities, like, spiders that can, that really extend their tactile worlds by building spider webs that can sense the tiniest of movements, far away through vibration signals and things like that. So then the adults answer in terms of their brains giving them superpowers.
Nice. That's
Thank
very
you.
deep.
Thank
So,
you.
how could you break that down for someone that don't really know much about neuroscience? Because that was a lot that you said. So if you can just break it down in layman terms for the
Sure.
average person, why would that be significant for us to know that?
Oh, sure. So I think firstly, why? So firstly, I think it builds an appreciation of the world that we live in. I think um, I really believe that brains make people unique, whether we're neurotypical, whether neuroatypical, and humans are visual by nature, but that doesn't mean that the other senses should be underestimated, right? There are people who are auditory savants. They can hear a song once and they can play it on like 20 instruments, right? Like
Yeah.
those kinds of abilities are special as well. And so I think one of the main goals for me was to kind of build an awareness of the natural world that we live in and the amazing things that animals can do. The second thing was also to kind of highlight how science or like research into these mechanisms have actually helped technology and medicine in everyday life. So I can think of one example where, bats and dolphins, they have echolocation. So basically what
Mhm.
they're doing is they're feeling out the world around them using sound signals. So they
Mhm.
send out these clicks. Some of them are super high
Mhm.
frequency. That was just an example. And
Okay.
then what they do is the sounds are reflected off of objects
Mm.
back to them. And so, by the properties of the sounds that are reflected back to them, they're able to see that they're able to know how far something is away or what size it is and things like that. So, like, bats are nocturnal, so there isn't a
Mhm.
lot of light in their
Right.
environment. Dolphins live under the sea
Mhm.
and so on. So, they're not able to use their visual environment as well. So their brains have shifted to using these kinds of technology, these kinds of principles to map the world around
Mhm.
them. And in during World War I and World War II, the technology of sonar was developed on exactly the same kinds of principles. So sonar technologies developed on these same, like, how does reflected sound
Mhm.
tell us about the properties of the object that the sound came back from,
Right.
right? And so a lot of the research on these kinds of sensory systems and research on the animal world and insect behavior and reptilian behaviors and sensory systems has actually also helped medicine.
Mhm.
So one technology I can think of in medicine is thermal sensing, so infrared sensing. So basically, instead of light, some animals like pit snakes can actually sense heat
Mhm.
coming off of objects, right? So they're mapping kind of like a hot versus cold environment around them. And one of the applications of understanding how those things work is to now use that in tumors, in
Mm.
cancer. So biologically and metabolically, cancer cells are just more active than the surrounding tissue, because they're dividing rapidly. That's one of their dysfunction, is that
Mhm.
they're cellularly dividing much faster than the surrounding tissue. And so, as you know, like for decades, we've been trying to find a way to selectively target things to tumor cells
Mhm.
without harming the surrounding normal cells.
Okay.
That's been the big challenge in developing a cure for cancer. But what they're now trying to develop are these nanorobots and nanobodies
Mhm.
that are heat seeking. So essentially, they're going to go not by vision, not by color or anything, but they're going to go and stick to these hotter cells. So it brings in a specificity, and it's bio-inspired design, right? And so
Okay.
understanding the world around us also helps us build on
Right.
technology in innovative ways.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. So I have a question. I'm
sure.
into sound therapy
Hmm.
heavily. Is there any way you can relate? Like I listen to binaural beats, and I know it's more or less based off of frequency and vibration, because
Yeah,
we're 70% water, so it affects us more that way.
yeah.
But what effect does it have as far as with our brain
Oh,
neurology? Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So I can definitely talk about that. So I should say primarily a lot of my research personally has been auditory. So it does
Okay.
hold like a special place in my heart.
Awesome.
Um, but I would say one of the things that rhythm, so again, in music, you can break it down into what affects the brain as well.
Mhm.
One of the things that have been definitively shown is that rhythm can affect the oscillations that are
Mhm.
happening in our brain. So one of the things that we've seen is that um, uh, there are intrinsic biological rhythms that are also, of course, there are external influences to that as well. Like a great example is sleeping, right? So most people sleep at night and are awake during the day. But then, of course, there are exceptions, night owls versus early birds and things like that. But so there are all these intrinsic rhythms in our bodies and our brains. So similarly, like in movement, a lot of the the circuitry that controls our movement and our fine tuning of those movements are actually rhythmic, and they're just underlying and happening in our brain. We don't know about it. What happens when we expose ourselves to either visual or auditory oscillating stimuli is that our brains basically start synchronizing to those rhythms. And so that kind of leads to this elevated experience of consciousness of but it can also be of joy. It's so different because everybody's brain is built differently, everybody's underlying rhythms are different, and so on. So we do see a lot of individual variability in these things, but it's definitely, so rhythm can definitely entrain our brains to these rhythms, to the frequency of the underlying. And then there's also influence of harmonics of the sound, right? And so another set of experiments, people have looked at how good are we at picking out a wrong note in a harmonic sound. And turns out we're pretty good at it, right? Like when something doesn't belong in a tone cloud or in a noise, and then that's like harmonic, and then you put in like that jarring note and people really hate it, right? And so we don't know as much, and that's one of the things I think that makes neuroscience a very rich field of study, is that there are things that we don't fully understand yet, and there's so much individual variability. But another thing I can tell you about music versus non-music folks is that our brains are very plastic. And so a couple of studies have shown that, like, if you listen to a lot of music and if you have musical training, the parts of your brain that process sound get thicker. They actually, get more robust, and you can measure your cortical thickness, and it's more for musical expertise than non-musical expertise. So music definitely seems to have a very powerful effect on our brains that isn't completely understood yet, but we're starting to unravel ways in which it might be affecting learning and memory. And the last thing I'll say about it is also our brains are very good at picking up patterns, right? And so whatever the pattern might be, whether it's in our visual world, whether it's in our motor worlds, like learning to do something like skiing or tennis or whatever. So patterns of information, like it comes in language or music or whatever. So our brains are good at picking those up underlying. So like if you listen to certain languages, actually any language that you don't know, when you first listen to it, it might not sound like anything. But if you listen to it long enough, one of the first things you start picking up are the pauses in the language, right? So you start picking up like the nuances of the sound. And that's something you notice before you start noticing the syllables and the words and the sentences. So again, this is something when you go into a language and you don't know it at all. Like, I don't know, like I don't know anything about Mandarin or Cantonese. And so when I listen to that, the first things I would notice are the pauses and the tones, right? So kind of like the auditory rhythm. And then you kind of build your auditory knowledge of a language from there. And that's how babies learn to learn different languages as well.
Nice. I have a lot of questions for you. So I have
Sure.
three, and then I'll let Mark, if he have any. Okay, so I'm pretty sure you probably heard the myth as far as the bigger the brain, the smarter the person. Now, is there
Okay.
any truth to that, or is just a fable that people like to put out there? It,
Yeah. So I would call that a myth.
okay.
Um, uh, it's really, I mean, because one of the things is our brains, human brains, are very, there's a lot of folds.
Hmm.
And so when you say big, what do you mean too, right? Like it's
Right.
just the gross size versus. So what I was saying earlier about cortex thickness being related to a musical expertise, that's just in a particular area that you measure the thickness, right?
Okay.
It's not the whole gross volume of the brain.
Hmm.
Um, Another thing is our brains have a lot of water. And
Hmm.
so when there's injury and when there's inflammation, there can be swelling.
Right.
And so the size, if you're talking about the gross size, that doesn't have anything to do with intelligence necessarily.
Okay.
But there are measures but you really have to go in and look at that particular thing. Like if you're looking at someone who's a car expert, right?
Hmm.
Then you would go to that like area of the brain that's processing faces and cars, which is like the fusiform face area. And then if you look at that area and compare that area's like volume, thickness, things like that, for people who are car experts versus people who are not car experts, you might find some differences,
Okay.
right? Yeah.
All right. So the next question. I'm retired military, so when I was in Afghanistan, I actually experienced a VBED, a
Okay.
vehicle-borne ID explosion. So when I
Okay.
came back to the States, I went to the VA and they performed a test as far as TBI.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the tests that was performed was a EEG.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the question I have is, I know a lot of times, you hear about people that may have a mental illness or whatever,
Yep.
and primarily with military, when they came back, they would do a questionnaire to see if you
Yep.
had PTSD. But
Yep.
when I went through, they actually measured the brain waves and they can see if there was any imbalances and so forth. So the
Mm-hmm.
question is, why is it that most tests for whether it's mental illness or
Mm-hmm.
PTSD is not used or tested with the EEG based off of a questionnaire?
So your question is why are more things based off of a questionnaire than EEG?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
It's really takes someone really brave to put themselves in danger to protect others, and that's amazing. Second, to answer your question, I think so. EEG it's so experimental neuroscience by itself is quite a new field.
Mm.
And one of the things that we need to do in scientific pursuits is understand what is normal before you can measure what is abnormal,
Okay.
or what is not functioning well. The problem with something like with something like TBI, but also like military injuries or PTSD or even trauma. There's different kinds of trauma. There's emotional
Hmm.
trauma. There's trauma based on race, trauma based on
Hmm.
sex, gender, and sex, and all of that. So all of those traumas, they're not well characterized because
Hmm.
everybody's traumas are unique,
Okay.
right? So it's hard to form a baseline of what those signals look like,
Okay.
um, and where they're coming from. So the other facet to this is just a limitation on how to measure signals from your brain
Mm.
in adults, adult humans or
Right.
children even, but like in humans, because a lot of what we know about the brain we get from animal studies, we get from computational simulations, but again, it's
Mm-hmm.
not the same as getting data from the human brain. So now there are emerging technologies. So I don't know if people have heard about it. There's certainly been news articles about it, but there's a new technology called induced pluripotent stem cells and building
Yeah.
organoids. So people
I
are
heard about
building organs in a dish. They're trying
Mm-hmm.
to build brains in a dish. I mean, it's still a far way off to
Mm-hmm.
start simulating what those signals look like.
Okay.
But I can imagine in a more mature state of that technology, you can build a robust baseline of what an IED
Mm-hmm.
damage would result in the EEG
Right.
signal to look like. So it's important because there are some things that we have established, right? There have been about 50 odd years of EEG studies. There are certainly lots of advantages of using EEG. The EEG studies, when they were first developed, were extremely clunky.
Mm-hmm.
You had to like sit there with like a lot of wires running from
Mm.
your head to the amplifier to the
Yeah.
computer. Now you can get like a dry EEG system and wear it as a hat while you're cooking,
Right.
right? Like so
Nice.
EEG systems are also developing.
Okay.
They're now wireless. We have a lot of baseline for things like reading, right? So you can just look at what reading signals look like from EEG. But again, the problem is like kind of identifying what signals look like when they're not working the way they're supposed to.
Okay.
And because again, trauma is individualized, it's difficult to build a baseline. I'm not saying that questionnaires are a great way
Right.
to get that baseline anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but that's that's gonna get at something, right?
Right.
And so in a world where we're trying to, I think, from the medical research community, we're trying to move towards personalized medicine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where someone comes in, we take your blood and take your testing and then give you like a combination of lifestyle interventions as well as medication if necessary that are addressing what is wrong with person A and not
Okay.
and it's not going to be the same as addressing the underlying conditions of person B, right?
Okay.
So to get to that, I think we're still a ways off, but it's promising. And then once we have that kind of like baseline data, it'll be easier to kind of
Right.
go in and address the underlying issue instead of generally here's
Mm-hmm.
some like painkillers and it'll take
Right.
care of the pain, and here's some like like I don't know, like blood thinners, like whatever. So like instead of giving you like cures for the symptoms, like giving you interventions that are going to address the underlying problem.
Okay. That makes
Yeah.
perfect sense. Because I'm
Thank
when
you.
I went to the VA, like I had all the wires attached to me. It was at the old style, and
Yeah.
so I asked the doctor. I said, "Can you tell me what the results are?" And she wouldn't give me the results. She said, "Oh, trust
Okay.
me, if something was wrong, you would know. Your chain of command would know." But so my
Okay.
last question for right now, as far as somewhere I read before, I don't know how long ago it was, but it was we only use like 10% of our brain. Is that true? And has it ever been anyone that used more than 10%? And if they have, what does that look like? If that makes sense, if you can.
Yeah. So again, it's one of those brain myths, I think,
Oh,
because again, you can talk about what does it mean to use your brain, right? Like even when we're breathing, there's like input, there's like a lot of oversight from our brainstem, breathing, baseline emotions, baseline activities, the feeling of things like hunger.
mm,
That's a hormone signal going from your hypothalamus
right.
based on things happening in your stomach. So all of these are things your brains are doing. So I'm drinking my cup of tea. One of the things I learned during grad school that really blew my mind is like every time like I'm taking a sip of tea, the weight of this object changes. And so your brain will automatically calculate to adjust the grip strength so
Mm.
that, because if you grip something too hard, it's going to crush or break.
Mhm.
If you grip something too soft, it's going to slip and fall down. So,
Okay.
like, as we go through life, everyday little activities that we're doing, our brains are constantly engaged. So,
Mhm.
there's no such thing as only using 10% of our brains. And the other thing, too, even when we're sleeping, actually, sleep is a state which is very important because your brains are incredibly active in that time.
Okay.
They are consolidating memories, consolidating things that were learned, clearing out debris. So our brains have all kinds of cells. They have immune cells to protect our brains from infections and other agents. There are supporting cells that are going to like see if there's some kind of damage and fix it, like glia. And so those cells are usually very active, rebuilding things that might have been overused, overstimulated during the day. So even in sleep, our brains are very, very active. And now we know there are like 7 stages of sleep. There's the rapid eye movement
Mhm.
stage. There's the slow wave sleep, and we still don't understand exactly what's happening in
Mhm.
each phase of sleep and so on. So yeah, that's definitely what I would call like an outdated understanding of how the brain is working
Okay.
to say that like 90% of it is not doing anything.
Okay. So I got one more, Mark. I promise I got one more.
All
I got a
right
lot
now.
for you. Okay. So I'm heavily into like the subconscious mind and the conscious
Mm-hmm.
mind.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could, is there such a thing? And if you could explain to the viewers what it is, because I always tell people it's in your subconscious mind. We literally like operate off of our subconscious and not our conscious mind.
Absolutely, 100% agree. So consciousness itself is a lot of people think that it's a byproduct of complex thoughts.
Mhm.
It's because we've evolved to be to need to plan for the future. And so if you want to plan for the future and you need information from the past of like what not to do, right? Like, oh, like if I was a squirrel, I didn't squirrel away something last winter and I was super hungry. And so this winter, before it comes, I should squirrel away more food, right?
Okay.
So those kinds of calculations means that when you're in the present, you need to have a complex construct of reality. And so that's kind of what consciousness is. It sits on
Okay.
top of all these other things that are happening in our brains. Like I told you what happens when you grip your cup,
Hmm.
and so absolutely a lot of most things are happening in subconscious learning, subconscious memory. There's also subconscious sensory perceptions where things are processed, but they don't actually reach your attentional level. A good example is if you start hearing some loud noise. At
Hmm.
first, you take notice of it, but over time, you'll notice that you don't hear it anymore. Or, like,
Mm.
if you walk into a room with a strong smell, you'll notice it at first, but over time, your brain, like, it just
Mm.
goes out of attention. It doesn't mean the stimulus is not there. It just means that your brain is like, this is not an important stimulus for me to
Okay.
focus on. And so all of these things, and then like, it's really, our brains are quite efficient and they've learned to solve problems efficiently. And so over time, if they have computed that it's easier to like just jump to this outcome, they're going to do that and not engage your consciousness. And so, yeah, both all stimuli can be subthreshold, anything can be subconscious, and a lot of our behaviors are driven subconsciously.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Oh, I got more. No worries.
Yeah, you so used to doing these shows by yourself now. That's why you dominate all the questions. But anyway, so I have a loaded question for you. So
Hmm.
bear with me. Now, this one concerns or consists with my grandson.
Okay.
Now, he's 3 years old. He's very alert. All his motor skills, he's 100%. The boy's very he can understand you, he comprehends, he does voice commands if you tell him anything, but he's not talking yet. Now I know the
Okay.
myth, and I'm actually this is even a true myth or not, where they say boys take longer than girls to start talking.
Okay.
Now the other myth is they also say if he's surrounded by other kids that can't talk, it's going to take longer for him to start speaking. But like I was saying, he's very intelligent. The other
Sure.
day he was at my house and I was cleaning the countertop and I said, Hakeem, no, don't touch that. I gotta clean it. So
Yep.
he goes and gets the sponge and start cleaning it himself. So he's very
Yeah.
intelligent. So
Yeah.
I guess what my question is, what would be the reasoning for him to take longer
Hmm.
to speak when all his motor skills is 100%? Like he's very comprehensive. Like I said,
Hmm.
he takes commands. The only thing is when he do talk, he does the typical. He can say mom, no. For some reason, all kids can say no.
Yep.
Uh, but the other words to him, because when you watch him, like he know what he's talking about. He
Yeah.
gets frustrated. He go when we don't understand him, but it's just coming
Yeah.
out like baby talk. Typical. The words are cluttered, and you really don't understand. You gotta make them say like 4 or 5 times. But so my
Yeah.
question is, what would stem to that, to where a kid could be that intelligent but
Yeah.
not able to speak yet?
Yeah. No, thank you very much for that question. I think that's very important to talk about, and to me, uh, it's just there are different things that we need to learn when we're children, and children's brains are like sponges, right?
Mhm.
It's they're really drinking in information about everything, about the world, about family, about like emotional learning and social learning, but also like visual learning, auditory learning, language. And um, generally speaking, because of individual variability,
Mhm.
the any kid is going to pick up something really quickly and take time on something else,
Right.
right?
Okay.
And it's just like kind of like the underlying baseline wiring, if you will. But there are ways to like accelerate or decelerate something like that. um I am not a child neuroscientist, so that's my disclaimer.
Right.
So it's not like I would know exactly what are the techniques to use to like accelerate learning and reading and things like that. I do know that if you like, you can read to kids a lot, because
Right.
reading and listening
Right.
is a very important part of learning to speak well.
Hmm.
um, and it can be just, not putting pressure on kids to learn anything at any rate, because like I said, I think uh, people like, I am more of an auditory person
Right.
than I am a visual person. That's how I've been since I was a kid. I would move to a song before I would watch something on TV or like even read a book. Like I was very driven auditorily.
Mhm.
And that persists today, but today I read a lot, right? So it's something, because that's my interest coming in, and my top-down conditioning of like, okay, reading is important. And
Mhm.
so that's the kind of like the bottom up versus top down as well. So
Right.
bottom up, we might be driven or built a certain way, but yes, top down, we can overcome that. We can
Right.
address it by structuring. So like, for example, if your grandson is more auditory, you can try audiobooks. You
Right.
can try reading to them every night. You can try baby census with him. I'm kidding.
There you go. Nice plug.
Yeah, I was
I was
joking.
waiting for it.
Um,
Yeah.
No, I kid, but I think one of the things which is unfortunate about our society that and that's one of the things I did kind of allude to in the beginning is that unfortunately I feel like certain kinds of intelligences are valued more in our
Mm.
society
Right.
than they should be.
Yes.
And I think that, kids who are tactile uh, have a unique way of seeing the world around, or not seeing, but like see even our
Mhm.
language is structured around visual things,
Hmm.
but like of interpreting the world and therefore might have something very unique to contribute to the world,
Right.
right? And so I am personally a very firm believer in nurturing the inherent uniqueness and talents of children, right? Don't try to like force something on them to conform to any kind of societal dictates or
Hmm.
diktats. Just nurture their interests, but of course, expose them to all kinds of knowledge and learning and tactile learning. Those there are now books with like textures built in and like for versus this and to like learn the alphabet or
Yeah.
different kinds of multimedia art classes to do reading or so find like innovative ways to like engage that aspect if that's not automatically grabbing their interest or attention.
Right.
Yeah, and so like if he's very good at like sports and moving and running around and like maybe as a reward after like a running session like sit down and read with him, so
Right.
something like that where so then reading then becomes associated with like a positive experience, which is also very important because oftentimes I found that working with kids that they're very easily discouraged from doing something.
Yeah.
Mm.
Hmm.
More than like, you can work and work and work to encourage them to do something, but then one bad experience, and then they're like, oh, I never want to do this again. But then the more you associate like a positive experience, like, oh, I get to spend time with grandpa, like that's a
Right.
positive experience. And then like it's like a cherry on the cake. And then that will bring his interest back into
Back.
reading and speaking and things like that.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's good. That was my first initial thought is the reading to him,
Yeah,
and that's what I was telling his mom is you read to him a little bit more. Pretty much everything you just said is the
yeah.
same thing that he's going to speech class now. Though he's in pre-K now,
Okay,
so
okay.
they did do a test on him, and that's why I
Hmm.
figured I just ask you kind of get your opinion on
Sure.
that because his mom did take them and they did a motor skills and all that, and they pretty much
Yep.
said basically the same thing you just said. Just read to
Yeah.
him more, get him more in tune with that part or aspect because everything
Yeah.
else he's a genius. Like it
Yeah.
amazes me the
Yeah.
intelligence of this kid. It's just his talking hasn't caught up to
Yeah.
his motor skills. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And actually, I think that happens in life anyway. Like when you look at kids in high school, right? There are some kids who are very, very good at social
Mhm.
skills, and then there
Right.
are other kids who are really good in like chemistry lab, but they're not
Mhm.
so good at social skills.
Right. Exactly.
And then it takes time. I think, a lot of people, by the time they come into their 20s, that's when they like kind of other things catch up.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So you can be really good at something in your early childhood, teens, and then your brain kind of like gets super focused on that to the exclusion of everything else. But then by the time you get to your 20s, it kind of all evens out and you get enough kind of input and learning and experience to balance out to have like a more balanced personality.
Yeah, and I
All
would
right.
say too, it takes the parents too, right? My all my kids are grown now, but to be patient because we do want our
Yeah,
kids to speak quickly, so we get a little frustrated. So that's
yeah,
where we have to be a little bit more understanding and know that yes, it's going to come if we just stick to the certain aspects of learning,
yeah.
teach them how to learn the right way instead of expecting to talk right away. Because my son, he started talking before he started walking, so
Hmm.
so it's crazy how that works out. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Okay,
Well, yeah, that's the
Doc.
one question I had. I'm gonna have another one, but I'm gonna let Matt take the floor again.
Okay, Doc. I don't know if I told you, but we're live on YouTube.
Yeah.
So one of the viewers have a question, and
Okay.
her question is: conclusions without consciousness sounds dangerous. Is there a bypass for that?
Sorry, what conclusions on consciousness? Sorry, can you read?
Conclusions, yes, conclusions without consciousness.
Ah, um, it's not necessarily dangerous, although of course it can be. It depends on what. Consciousness is very, very effortful. It takes a lot of energy. Our brains are actually at any given moment consuming 30% of the food that we eat, like the energy from the food that we eat, even though it does not occupy 30% of our bodies, right? Like our brains are quite small. They're usually the size of your fist, a
Mm-hmm.
little bit bigger than the size of your fist. And so it's very effortful. And so usually conscious decisions are coming from a place of importance, right? So when things are important, they do get to your consciousness, and then there are decisions. Um, but decisions doesn't mean the kind of, I think, popular opinion decisions. Sometimes you need to take a decision about an obstacle on the road,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so like your brain is making decisions all the time about to step left or to step right, because there's a barrier on the sidewalk. And if you step to the left, you're going to be closer to the street. If you step right, you might trip and fall into someone's garden, right? So those kinds of decisions as you're going through life, they become incredibly draining if all of them are reaching your consciousness. So a lot of those for children who are learning to walk for the first time, everything is conscious. It's like when you're learning to play the piano in the beginning, everything is conscious and it's very effortful. You get tuckered out when you're learning a new musical instrument. A few years in, you don't think about it. You just do it. You're not thinking about, oh, do I strum this string? Do I play this key? You're not consciously thinking about everything. Your fingers are making the decision based on experience. So those are the kinds of shortcuts I mean. Now, this being said, yes, there can be biases and problems when our brains do this. A good example is face recognition, and sometimes you get biases based on race and things like that, which are unconscious and subconscious, and biases to gender minorities and things like that. These
Mm-hmm.
become sometimes, unfortunately, one of these shortcuts, because maybe someone was raised in a very conservative environment, and that's the rule of thumb that their brains have been automatically applying. So
Mm-hmm.
you no longer think about it consciously. So, it's a balance. I think when someone points it out, when you become aware of certain biases in your behavior, it's important to think about it and then rewire it consciously, right? And kind of like to pause and make a conscious decision to not let in that subject matter rush into like biases or judgment. But then when it comes to things like walking, that is how it needs to be, because could you imagine how burdensome life would be
Mm.
if every little thing that we did, we had to think about it? Like that would be an impossible way to live.
Yeah,
Yeah. Like I would have to
uncomfortable.
think about lifting my cup. I would have to think about blinking enough so my eyes are lubricated. Like it's just an impossible way to go through life.
Okay, awesome. So this is my next question. I'm a not physical, massage therapist as well. So
Okay.
one of my favorite modalities is craniosacral. So as a neuroscientist, why is it not I want to say push, but why is it not supported as much? Because it's very effective. Like I've actually
Okay.
seen it work. I have clients. So in your opinion, is that something that you feel as though this should be more um supported or more, put into hospitals and put into
Okay.
therapy sessions?
So you've touched upon a really interesting topic that I will admit that I don't know much about. I do have a very close friend who is a physical therapist and should probably be better at
Yeah.
answering these questions. But in general, I will say that I think there's not enough emphasis on alternative
Mhm.
medicines, alternative kind of interventions.
Mhm.
Interventions is the word I was thinking of, um, to address a lot of physical problems. Fortunately, I do see a change coming. I see like there's been a couple of uh, largely funded studies looking, and it's called the Fingers study, worldwide fingers now. It started off in a
Mhm.
couple of Nordic countries, I think Sweden. Um, and now it's like a worldwide study where they're looking specifically at lifestyle interventions for things like Alzheimer's and dementia
Mhm.
and things like that. And so there is an interest in um, funding, investing in, and understanding better, like mechanistically, how these things work. But again, it's one of those things that it's not to sound cynical, because I
Right.
still I love science. I think the scientific endeavor is beautiful, but the system can be a little bit entrenched. It can be
Mhm.
a little bit entrenched when it comes to new ideas, new ways of doing things. So, for example, open science was a big push that we
Mhm.
did. And when it first, in neuroscience, when we first started doing that, there was a lot of pushback, right? People didn't want to share their data. People didn't want to do collaborative science the same way. But a few years later, now you see more and more teams are moving towards that because they see the benefits of it. They see that your contributions are not diminished, but rather the work gets enriched, and you get
Mhm.
to the answer faster when there are these diverse minds coming together to solve it. Open science, big science kind of principles. So it's one of those things, I think, looking at alternative ways of addressing physical trauma, physical issues. It does need um, more scrutiny, more
Mhm.
investigative time and resources. I agree with you there, but yeah.
Okay. All right. So my next question,
Mhm.
as far as now this may be another myth, increasing your brain cells. How would you go about doing that? My thought is always reading, just
Mm.
educating yourself more.
Yeah.
What's the best way of doing that?
So there's a concept of cortical real estate, right? Um, and use it or lose it.
Mm-hmm.
So the more you practice, the more you use a part of your brain, the better you get at it. That's just a fact,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so learning new things, forcing your brain to do things that in a different way, excellent way to like keep your brain limber, if you will, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of agile, and be able to jump from one idea to another. So those kinds of
Mm-hmm.
things comes from constantly learning, constantly. I completely agree with you there.
Okay.
um, and learning new languages. So there's
Mm-hmm.
been a lot of studies that show that if you're bilingual, if you're multilingual,
Mm-hmm.
then if you get some kind of disorder like dementia, you're going to be slower at losing cognitive abilities compared to single
Mm-hmm.
lingual persons. And sometimes it's kind of like, if you think about like a highway of information skidding
Mm-hmm.
around, uh, it's like building additional roads between point A and point B when you learn a
Mm-hmm.
new language or a new skill. And so if you have a road breakdown in one place, you can still access the information through a different road. Um, and at least that's how I kind of think about it. And so, so those would be the things that I would say are very important. The other thing I would say too is I mentioned earlier that our brains are consuming 30% of the energy that we're consuming from food. And one of the things that's happened in modern society is there's a huge emphasis on looking a certain way. And a lot of people starve themselves in midlife. The problem is in midlife, bodies go through a lot of changes. For example, women go through menopause that changes hormonal content in their bodies and their brains. And so weight gain or weight loss is inevitable. So we shouldn't put extra pressure on our bodies by starving ourselves because these kinds of changes are inevitable. And so eating healthy and um, being active. I won't even say like you have to go to the gym and be a gym
Right.
rat. That's not what I'm trying to say. But like not being a couch potato all the time, like being reasonably active, using your muscles just like your brain. If you don't use it, they get flabby and they don't,
Right.
you lose them. And so being active and eating well. And I doesn't mean like go and like binge eat McDonald's or something. That's not what I mean. Like eating healthy, making sure you
Right.
get your proteins, your carbohydrates, your fats, like all of these are the building blocks of your body. And so if what happens when I say midlife starvation, your brain, what it does is our brain is a very fatty organ. Um, that's because they're cables of insulation. A lot of the signals that are being passed from one end, like the minute sound enters your cochlea, the physical auditory stimulus is converted into an electrical signal called an action potential. And so these signals are now electrical and they have to be carried through cables of fat. So the fat is now an insulation layer to allow the conductance of these electrical signals. So
Okay.
because the myelin, this is called the myelin, myelin is fatty. When we don't eat enough fat, our brains start breaking down its own myelin.
Mm. Okay. So that's probably why when bodybuilders do the what is it, carb deficit, they kind of get the what do they call it? What is it called, Mark? Carb brain. They call it carb brain or something like that.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
see,
yeah.
I don't follow that. I'm like, whenever people tell me they're going on a diet, I
hmm
inwardly wince. I'm like,
Yeah.
it's important to live healthy. Don't get me wrong. Like I like to go on hikes and this and
hmm
that, but it's not, but at the same time, like, and also not to like overeat, right? But your
hmm
body always sends you endogenous signal. Like when you're hungry, you know you're hungry.
Right.
So like if you're like honestly listen to your body and like make sure you get a balanced diet with your essential fats and your proteins and everything, and then you don't have to worry about it so much because you're
Okay.
making sure that your body has all the substrates it needs to do all the actions that you need to do in life.
Love it. So I have two more questions for you.
Okay.
So the first one, does androgyny start in the brain, or is that something that someone can actually just do within themselves? That's the first question. And when I say androgyny, as far as
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the myth again, as far as left side of the brain, right side, women are
Okay.
more left side being the feminine energy, and men, the masculine being the logical side.
Yeah.
So as far as being androgynous, it starts with the
That's what you
brain.
meant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a very fascinating topic. So there are biological differences, hormone driven as well as genetic driven, between men and women. Women tend more to store fat, men tend more to store protein. So there are metabolic differences. There are differences in the way we process emotions, for
hmm
sure. I think everyone is familiar with like the character traits that come with
hmm
different levels of testosterone versus different levels of estrogen and things like that. As far as cognitive abilities goes, I have only seen really one sort of inconclusive study that showed that men were marginally better at spatial orientation tasks, but women were better at social orientation tasks. That's the only study that I've seen. But like, if you look at things like ability at math, ability at logic, there's no difference that has been documented in research studies between men and women in terms of intelligence, in terms of ability, and things like that. And I think one of the reasons is that our brains are very resilient. And there are redundancies in pathways. So oftentimes you'll see like people who say have a stroke or whatever, they'll lose the ability to say read, right? But then 6 months with rehab, they can read again. And it's not because that part of the brain grew back. It's because their brains have found a different way to get to the solution. And it might take longer, but they can still do it. And I think this is one of those things where it's mind over matter and will over matter, where, you know, a lot of people who have grit and who are determined to do things, they don't let these things stand in their way, and they find a way to do it and do it well. And so those kinds of individual variabilities kind of throw a spanner in the works of these studies, trying to show that there are gender differences in intelligence. The second thing is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier with the children and the different kinds of intelligences as well. A measure of intelligence that's universally accepted has not been found. Right?
Wow.
Like IQ, I don't believe in IQ. Like, what does IQ really say? Like, what you can read numbers, you can do math calculations, but that's a kind of intelligence. It doesn't include other kinds of intelligences. It doesn't include things like being more intuitive to social situations. And so those are my 2 cents about that.
Okay, so my last question. This is
Okay.
coming from a viewer. Are there things we can do to postpone or avoid dementia? Like time in the sauna or avoiding aluminum?
So that's a loaded question, and
It
I'll
is.
try to, and it's difficult because um you know, there's so many things that affect dementia and are, because dementia is a symptom, right? And so, for example, PTSD can be a predictor of developing dementia through multiple pathways, right? A lot of people with PTSD or any kind of trauma, they have trouble sleeping. And I was talking to you earlier about like sleep is very important because it clears out the junk that's been accumulated during the day when your brain didn't rest. And it happens through the glymphatic system, and it kind of pushes all this cellular debris into your blood, and pushes it out, you know, through urine or sweat or whatever. So there's sleep, but then there's also nutrition. But then yeah, trauma kind of hits both, right? And so
Right.
there are multiple pathways to get to dementia. The promising thing is like there are studies now and clinical trials that are being conducted to look at lifestyle improvements, to look at specific supplements, non-pharm as well as pharmacological interventions to address dementia. Another thing that's very poorly understood are things like how does things like neighborhood safety and area deprivation affect mental health, because it absolutely does.
Wow.
Right? So there have been studies that show that people who are in what's called housing insecurity, who are in danger of being evicted, they have more cardiovascular risk. And if you have more cardiovascular risk, you have a higher risk of getting dementia. So
Wow.
because dementia is a symptom, there are multiple pathways to get there. So to answer your question, I think not to overwhelm you or overwhelm any of the listeners, but it's important to like ignore the things that are out of your control. There's also a genetic component that's not under
Mm-hmm.
your control, so ignore those and focus on the things, the lifestyle improvements that you can do that's going to help. So those are
Okay.
going to be getting good night's sleep, avoiding this midlife starvation during no it's really because the prodromal phase for Alzheimer's or dementia is from like 10 years 10 to 15 years before the onset of symptoms,
Oh, wow.
right? So it's really like throughout like the middle of your life, you should
Mm-hmm.
pay attention to like eating well,
Mm-hmm.
sleeping well, and getting moving your body. Again, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily like getting cardio exercise versus lifting weights or anything, but like
Right.
move your body to the amount that works for you and for your metabolism.
Okay.
And so those are the things that we can control. Stay informed, read more about new studies and new clinical trials as they're published, as new findings come out. So yeah, do the things under your control.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Marcus, what do you have?
I forgot my question now. So you pretty much just spoke on it. So you might be answering the same question already. Again, I might just be put
Okay.
in a different way than the way Matt asked it. Now, it's correct me if I'm wrong, if this is even a myth or if there's even truth to this. A buddy of mine and I was talking the other day. We was talking about on our differences and how we have the ability to comprehend. Now, for myself, I'm more of a visual. You could
Okay.
put me in a classroom and it take me so much longer to comprehend it. But if you put me in front of it and show me, I'll pick it up in a heartbeat.
Mm,
And then he was stating that, oh, I'm the type of person, I'm in a classroom setting, I learn it, give it to me, and I comprehend it, and then I go do the job. And then he was basically saying that I'm smarter than you because I can comprehend in the classroom, and that's what we
yeah.
got in the debate. And I'm like, there's no truth to that. It's just I'm more of a individual. I can see it and then I can pick it
Yeah.
up. And in the
Yeah.
classroom, I'm the type of person where I guess I get bored easily. If it's
Sure.
just sitting in one place too long, I drift off.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, if there's a myth to that, is there even truth to that at all? That's
Yeah,
just
so no, yeah, I certainly don't believe so. I can't speak for the entire neuroscience community, but I think um, intelligence is such a nuanced thing that it's really difficult to measure. There are autistic savants with eidetic memory. They look at something once and they'll remember it forever. I
Mm-hmm.
certainly am not eidetic. I forget things all the time, but I've done fairly well, and I in my career and in my book. So I'm not. I certainly don't subscribe to the idea that intelligence only comes in one form. And the other thing that I personally don't like subscribe to is this idea that uh, people have to contribute the same way to society, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the or even in a team, like I worked the teams that have been diverse with different points of views and ideas, and those points of views were encouraged and not suppressed when they're different. Those have been the most innovative and productive teams that I've personally worked in. And so this idea of neurodiversity is something I'm a very passionate believer in. Um, and yeah, so again, in baby census, I tried to pick these animals like frogs that are kind of slimy and icky, but frogs are incredibly intelligent because they have sensors that are able to that are able to detect the flow of currents in when they're underwater. And tadpoles, as babies, they're able to like throw themselves out of danger's way, and pull themselves out. When I was a baby, if you put me in water, I would have gone with the tide and been drowned, right? Like, does that mean that that frog tadpole is more intelligent than me?
Right.
Right? And so again, it's you know, oftentimes also, like, our brains are resilient and beautiful and intelligent, and they find ways to optimize and survive in the environments that we're in. So yes, there's a baseline of like nature versus nurture, of like what are you born with baseline. But then, some people grow up in incredibly difficult environments, where then the mandate for your brain becomes survival. And so that is then what your brain becomes optimized to do.
Right.
That isn't a comment on anybody's intelligence. And in as they when they're adults, if they are now suddenly in safer environments where their learning can be encouraged, they can bloom. They can learn, they can read as adults and write and be incredibly productive um members of society. So yeah, but this is like my my personal, I'm
Personal
not
opinion.
speaking on anybody's behalf, but
Right.
I don't think that intelligence comes in one form.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Awesome. Well, I love it. So Doc, we're gonna have to have you back on for
It would
part
be my
two,
pleasure. Yeah.
because there's so much information and there's so many questions I have, but I don't want to take up your time. So the viewer KJ, she's the one that's been asking all the questions. She said, "Thank you so much. Everything has been very informative," and she would like to know how can she purchase the children's book.
Oh, sure. So I have my website as well. It's just babycensusbook.com. It's available on Amazon. If you can put the links, I think I've sent them to you,
Yes,
Matthew. If you can
yes.
put the links under, that would be great. Yeah, it should be available on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble website as well. Yeah. And I'm available. If you have any other questions as well, feel free to email me, or reach out through my website, through the book's website. Again, it's called babycensusbook.com.
Okay, awesome.
I'm gonna get
So
that
again, I just
myself.
want to excuse me, thank you. And like I said, I'm going to reach out again and have you on a
I
second
would be,
time.
it would be my honor. And thank
Awesome.
you so much, KJ, also for like listening and honoring me with your questions. I appreciate it. And
Okay.
both of you. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. So until next time, you enjoy your day and have a blessed week.
Thanks, you as well. Again, thank you for your service and thanks for having me on. It's
Okay.
been a true pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
All
Bye
right.
bye. All right. There you have it, beautiful people. This wraps up another episode of the Day and Night podcast. Very, 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 very good information. I had a
Yes.
whole bunch of more questions, so she's definitely going to be back on.
Yes.
So hopefully everybody enjoyed it. Again, KJ, thank you for the questions. Our most dedicated and faithful and loyal what do you call viewer or subscriber. So I appreciate you. Much
Driver.
love. And again, everybody, welcome back to Mark. Hopefully everything is good and he can continue
Yeah.
to be the other half of this Day and Night podcast. If there's anything you have to say as we part ways for this last episode.
No, just I'm back and I'm here to stay. We all, like I said on the opening, life happens sometimes, but this is a very good show, and I've been watching your last three podcasts, and they all been good. So I just, like I said before, I love the guests you have on here. I love the topics. So keep tuning in, guys, because it's very good, informative information. So it enlightens you, enlightens me on a lot of stuff that I didn't know. So I love it. So I'm looking forward to the next one.
Okay. So with that being said, I will have the link for excuse me, her book posted on Wednesday. when the video is posted again. And yeah, so just check it out. And as always, beautiful people, your thoughts becomes your beliefs, and your beliefs becomes your reality. All right, y'all be good.